Anthony Lacavera never wanted to sell Wind Mobile in the first place. So why is it so hard for him to buy it back? Hello and welcome to another episode of the BetaKit podcast. I'm Douglas Saltis, editor-in-chief of BetaKit, and my co-host, as always, is Rob Kennedy. Today our guest is one Globalive chairman, Anthony Lacavera. If you are new to Canadian entrepreneurship, you might not be familiar with that name, but dude is an OG. He has been in the trenches. You think running your SaaS startup is hard? Try launching a national telecom competitor, failing to find local financing, and having to raise capital from an Egyptian telecom, only to be told by the CRTC just before launch that your company doesn't meet Canadian ownership requirements. As Lacavera says on this podcast, he never wanted to sell Wind in the first place. And it doesn't seem like Shaw wants Wind, now called Freedom Mobile, anymore anyways. So why is he having such a difficult time getting it back? Lacavera makes his case on this podcast as to why he thinks he has the best offer around for Freedom. But it doesn't seem like the best offer is the highest concern in this scenario. You see, on this podcast, we might talk about Canadian tech and tech from a Canadian perspective, but today we're in Competitiontown, where freedom of choice is hard to come by. Just ask Matt Boswell, our competition commissioner, who's currently trying to block the Rogers-Shaw merger that's driving the Freedom sale in the first place. If the Competition Bureau isn't successful, and mediation between the Bureau, Rogers, and Shaw starts July 4th, that would prevent Lacavera from having an opportunity to buy Freedom at all. If it's not successful, Lacavera is hoping the PMO will step in and force a sale of Freedom that would give Canadians a viable fourth telecom. And if that doesn't happen, well, we asked Lacavera on the podcast if he'd be willing to build a new telecom from scratch if he can't buy back Freedom. His answer? Let's dig in. Tony, man, let's get this thing started. Back in the day, we would have just rolled up to your office with a bunch of gear and then just done it live. I miss those days.
Well, they're coming back, I think. Let's hope, right?
Let's hope. In the meantime, I just want to start right off the top. Why did you sell Wind in the first place? And why do you want it back now?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is one I've been asked a lot lately. Why did you sell? And the answer is, I was very opposed to selling. I publicly opposed selling. It was reported in a feature in the Globe and Mail at the time in 2016. The only reason we sold Wind Mobile was our investor group was unable to get regulatory approvals to continue in Canada. And that put us in a very difficult situation where we were forced to recap it with private equity. And when we did that recapitalization, I lost control of the business because it was a forced recap. It had to happen very quickly. And unfortunately, very sadly, it was around the first Russian invasion of the Ukraine. My investor group in Wind, a couple of them were based in Amsterdam, but ultimately with Russian ownership, and that created obviously some complications, and they were unable to get regulatory approvals in Canada. We were forced to recapitalize it with private equity, and when that happened, I lost control. And then immediately Shaw came in and made an offer that was attractive to private equity, and even though I publicly opposed selling and did not want to sell it, we were forced to sell. And
Gotcha.
So the reason I want it back because I didn't want to sell it in the first place.
And it seems now like Shaw would like to sell it. So just noting the fact that you had to capitalize the creation of Wind in the first place globally because you couldn't find that capital available in Canada, which is a huge delta from where we are in 2022. We can swing back to some of the history and maybe the differences between then and now. But what's the current state of the sale process to try and buy it back? Because you would think, oh, hey, Shaw decided they don't want this anymore. Tony never wanted to sell in the first place. Globalive's doing well. There's capital available. This is a bang deal, right? And we get a fourth carrier being run by a guy who didn't want to sell in the first place. Tell us that is currently what's going down.
Yeah, look, that's not at all what's going down. That's what we would you would think makes sense, right? That we were out there before with Wind. We brought prices down over 20% in all the English-speaking markets we were operating in, in Ontario, BC, and Alberta. That meant over $400 a year of average household savings. And because prices came down across the market, everybody was realizing those savings, whether you were a Wind Mobile customer or not. And that's most definitely, in terms of my whole entrepreneurial journey, what I'm most proud of, having that kind of positive impact on families. And, the number is over $400 a year, which means a lot in after-tax income for Canadian families. So I'm excited about the opportunity to do that again. We will most definitely bring prices down again. As everybody knows, they've gone back up. Canadians are back paying some of the highest prices in the world for mobile services again. So there's no doubt the fourth carrier is needed. But on that point, Douglas, if you're Bell, TELUS, or Rogers, and in this case, we're talking about Rogers because they're the ones acquiring Shaw and they're the ones required to divest or sell Freedom Mobile in order to close the Shaw acquisition. If you're Rogers, you naturally want the weakest possible competitor because you don't want prices to come down. So if you're a Rogers shareholder and you're Rogers ownership, you're sitting there saying, how do we make sure the fourth carrier is the weakest possible carrier? Because if they're strong, that means prices are going to come down and that's going to eat into our profits, right? So this is actually just that simple. And that means Globalive, our group, is the least desirable buyer of Freedom Mobile for Rogers. And so they've been working their way down a list of potential buyers, starting with in the Q1 of this year, they started with Birch Hill Private Equity, which is extremely friendly to Rogers. Then that got rejected effectively by the government. They moved on to ExploreNet, couldn't get buy-in there, another weak competitor. Then they moved on to the Aquilini family, who are actually friends with the Rogers family, if you can believe it, like business partners in various things, including various real estate, initiatives and so on. Very friendly. That one was dead on arrival in Ottawa, thankfully for Canadians. And now they've moved on to Videotron. But the reason they're trying with Videotron now is because the others got rejected. And Videotron is interesting for them because Videotron is a cable company in Quebec. And they're selling bundle services in Quebec, which means we all know that. We all get a bundle, or a lot of us get a bundle: home phone, internet, cable, and wireless. And Videotron is not going to be an effective competitor in Ontario, BC, and Alberta. They're not going to bring prices down because if they do try to compete in Ontario, BC, or Alberta, immediately Bell, TELUS, and Rogers are going to react and attack them in Quebec. So there is a built-in disciplinary action against Videotron as a wireless carrier in Ontario, BC, and Alberta because of that reaction, that retaliatory strike in Quebec. And the math is actually very simple on that too. If you got a $200 a month bundle customer in Quebec and you got a $40 a month Freedom Mobile customer in Ontario, BC, or Alberta, if I'm Videotron, I run a promotion in Ontario, I acquire another $40 a month customer, and Bell reacts and takes a $200 a month customer. So the math is I got to acquire 5 customers in Ontario, BC, or Alberta to replace 1 lost customer in Quebec, meaning there is no chance that Videotron will compete in Ontario, BC, or Alberta as a wireless carrier. Prices will go sideways to up. They will be a very disciplined fourth carrier. And it's not because I don't think they would potentially like to compete, but the legacy business is an absolute boat anchor that cannot ever give them freedom to compete. Now, I would say this: they know how to run a wireless business. They're doing it very effectively in Quebec when it's in a bundle. And if they sold the legacy Quebec cable business, then I would say, okay, now they know how to operate. They've got a proven track record of lowering prices in wireless in Quebec. Now they're not encumbered by the legacy business. Now they're an interesting option. And I think, obviously I'm just making this up because obviously that's never going to happen. They're not selling their legacy business. It's a cash cow, but that is what they would have to do to be free to actually compete. So regional cable companies are not the answer. We saw what happened when Shaw acquired Freedom Mobile. And there's an interesting report published by Adam Shine, a National Bank analyst, where Freedom actually is doing better in Ontario, where Shaw does not have a bundle, than it is doing it in BC and Alberta in terms of growth. And the reason is Shaw is never going to be aggressive in BC or Alberta in wireless. Why? Because TELUS will retaliate and take a bundled customer. They can gain a Freedom Mobile customer in Vancouver, they lose a bundled customer back to TELUS. And the same math applies: 5, 6, 7 to 1.
On the price matching component, I say this as someone who worked for Mobile Syrup for many, many years. This would be something that we would track on a week-by-week basis, where you would see one carrier initiate some new pricing or bundle, usually an increase, but sometimes a repackaging. And then the 2 other major carriers, within a week, sometimes with even days, would effectively be matching that price because there are thousands of people across Canada reading sites like Mobile Syrup to track that price looking to switch. The second component that we haven't even introduced here that I want to make sure our listeners are familiar with, this is something that Shaw owns. The reason why you're talking about Rogers is that they're currently being merged together, which is something that the Competition Bureau is currently trying to fight. So you're not even negotiating in good faith with the people who bought you previously. You're negotiating against or with or trying to send an offer to someone who would eventually be your competitor within this context.
That's absolutely right, Douglas. But I go further and say that, back to my earlier comment, if I'm a good business person, I want to have the weakest competitor I can possibly have because I want to grow my business as fast as I can. So Rogers is always, by definition, going to put forward the weakest competitor they can get approved.
So then, Tony, like, what is the argument that's being made to keep you out of the deal, and how do you respond to it?
They don't really have a legitimate argument because we're the only ones, we're factually the only ones throughout the 40-year history of wireless in Canada that brought prices down in Ontario, BC, and Alberta. And so there was a short period with City Fido. You guys remember way back in the day, City Fido.
Mm-hmm.
That was an amazing offering, but it wasn't durable. It didn't last, right? And Microsoft ended up getting sold to Rogers, of all things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Fido ended up getting sold to Rogers. But I think there is no good reason. And so this is why government oversight and, if necessary, government intervention is necessary, guys. Canadians need the government to step in and say, we're not going to accept a weak, fake competitor as the fourth carrier. We want it to be a well-capitalized, independent, real competitor. And so I think that's why you're seeing the proposals put forward by Rogers get rejected. I think that's been great for Canadians. Whether our group wins it, whether Globalive wins it back or not, our position has been very clear, and we've sent correspondence to the government in this effect. I've said it publicly to this effect. Canadians just need to ensure, the government just needs to ensure on behalf of Canadians that it is a true independent competitor. That's the only way we're going to see prices come down in Ontario, BC, and Alberta.
So basically, they're just not calling. There's no argument. They're just not picking up the phone. I know that you've called them. They're not calling you. There's no argument. We don't want to talk to you because there's competition. ... Something scary. Then the argument that those folks typically make as well is that, like, look. Let us do the deal. We understand that there's a concentration of power, but we'll invest $1 billion in towers and hair and cats and stuff like that to serve underserviced communities.
Northern Ontario will finally get cellular service.
For some reason, every time these acquisitions happen, it's the same argument, and I wonder if that's actually really happened. But what's your take? I was going to say, what is your take on that? And like, I remember, when they're putting up towers for when Bell and TELUS went in together with LTE. There were like tower wars where they'd like fill up towers so they didn't have to let each other, you know what I mean? Like they would just fill up with unnecessary capacity so that brands like Wind would have to like build their own towers and spend trillions of dollars just to kind of not play fair, even with each other. What is your take on their argument about spending that money on those underserved communities? And is that a real argument?
It is a real argument, Rob. The question is will the government hold their feet to the fire?
Yeah.
Right.
Have they held their feet to the fire, I think.
Historically, it's been a challenge, right? Historically, commitments have been made that have not been met. And that's been disappointing to Canadians. And we're talking about a lot of rural communities that still don't have. And now we have things like Elon Musk's Starlink coming over the top, right? With low Earth orbit satellite solutions. And not just them, but a number of low Earth orbit satellite constellations, OneWeb, et cetera, that are all, launching, going to be offering service that way. And I think that is going to put more pressure on the terrestrial carriers to come in and actually offer service. But the place we're in right now is that a lot of those undertakings to do, near rural build-outs have not been met. I think that it's critically important that the government not let this transaction go through even if they are going to permit it, which, by the way, the overwhelming majority of Canadians, the polling shows clearly, do not even want to see this deal close. 70-80% of Canadians know this is bad for competition. And so they just don't like it. They already don't like Rogers very much. They already don't like Shaw very much. They really don't like the idea of them combined. They just feel like that's going to lead to higher prices. And they're right. And job losses, right? This is going to lead, as much as they're making, noise about it not reducing jobs. There's over $1 billion of synergies contemplated in this cable merger. Synergies. What's that coming from? That's coming from payroll, right?
Yes. If you talk to any Roger employee right now, they are very concerned about who from them or Shaw will be maintaining that position because there's significant redundancy. But let's tease this up before the competition component and the government component of this are huge. And for anyone who's been listening to this podcast in the last year, we've been banging the competition drum. We've had a free Matt Boswell t-shirt that we've been getting senators wear. Like, we should get you one as well. Although you might be slightly biased in the reasons why, but from the average consumer perspective, that's duly noted. Just one thing, you're noting Starlink coming in and consumers wanting that because they've existed in an environment where they don't have choice, right? There are no other telecoms that can kind of come into this market before, and we've seen the protectionist fight against there. I want first your argument for your capacity to make this happen, because I know you're talking about a lot about wind and price savings there. I understand how the Rogers shareholder might be willing to take less of a return on selling the Freedom/Wind assets to someone other than you, because long-term that's going to benefit their Rogers shares by not actually having firm competition. What is your capacity to make the new Freedom, the new Wind, Tony Mobile, whatever you want to call it, actually a competitor in Canada? And how does TELUS play a role in here? Because you still need to go to one of the incumbents for spectrum and network. So how has that been negotiated?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, look, I'm really proud of the spectrum and network sharing deal we did with TELUS. It's the first of its kind, as you guys know. What this is going to mean is we're going to be able to offer the same great prices and value that we offered with Wind, but now we're going to be able to offer it with the same network experience as the big three wireless carriers. And as you guys know, from having been around it, back in the day when we first launched Wind, like, it was painful. The big three had a 25-year head start on network. So we're trying to build towers and sites as fast as we can, but there were holes in the network. The network experience wasn't great. And so why this partnership, spectrum and network sharing agreement with TELUS is so unique and transformational is that we're going to be able to have all the Freedom Mobile customers enjoy a network experience on par with Bell, TELUS, and Rogers. And I say Bell, TELUS, and Rogers, it's the TELUS network, but obviously those three are about on par with each other. So obviously we're not sharing with Rogers and we're not sharing with Bell. This is a sharing deal with TELUS. What it means is all of the Freedom spectrum that we're buying, about 100 megahertz, gets put into a pool with all of the TELUS spectrum, which is about 200 megahertz, rough numbers. Because now there's 300 megahertz total, and we're sharing all that spectrum. The RAN, the radio access network, of all the cell towers and cell sites that is Freedom, it's about 2,500 cell sites or so. That gets contributed. It's a much smaller radio network than the TELUS radio network. So the agreement we've structured is we're going to be receiving payments in the form of spectrum utilization, because even though we're only contributing 100 megahertz of the 300 megahertz total, we're using so much less of the spectrum because the subscriber base of Freedom is so much smaller that there's a net payment our way on spectrum utilization. The other way, we're contributing a much smaller radio network. Now, granted, we have a much smaller number of subscribers too, but it's a much smaller radio network. So we're paying out to TELUS to access that radio network. And that's, at a very high level, that's the agreement. I'm really excited about it because, again, the net effect is that people are going to have a network experience on par with the big three. And that was always the only real challenge we had with Freedom, right?
Do you have the CapEx to expand upon that beyond the initial launch, though, right? Because we know that this is capital intensive, and we know what Bell and TELUS have done together to get them competitive to the network that Rogers had. Do you have the phase 2 plan, or is the phase 1 just to show viability for performance for current customers in that manner?
There's going to be an immediate improvement for existing customers, but we're also obviously planning to acquire more spectrum, right? There's 3.5 spectrum that Videotron currently holds that's contested, although the courts have granted it to Videotron, it looks like now. So they're not going to, as they did before with AWS-1 and with 700, they're going to arbitrage that spectrum, want to take a profit, arbitraging the new entrant rules, which Canadians should be very unhappy about that. No one knows about it, but they're getting a profit on the back of taxpayers with that subsidy. But beyond the 3,500, we're going to acquire 600. We're going to keep participating in the auctions that are coming up. So yes, there is a forward capital plan. To answer your question directly, we need to continue to acquire spectrum, and obviously the consumption profile that we all know just from our own personal consumption of mobile services is exploding. So we need more spectrum, but we also recognize that there's that with 5G and ultra fast and ultra low latency networks, everything from autonomous vehicles, autonomous transportation generally, smart city infrastructure, connected healthcare, connected education, all of these things now are becoming the metaverse, AR, VR, XR, all these things are now a reality, right? So
Tony, that's great. I just don't want to pay $100+ a month for my cell plan for non-unlimited, highly capped usage. Like, great. I would love to connect every doorknob in my house to something. Please give me a plan where I don't have to spend $100 to just sit in my house and be on Wi-Fi. Like, come on.
I'm with you, man. I think you should probably call Bell, Telus, or Rogers about that right now. Because, I was the one who was offering great deals, and I will again.
Yes, but at that point in time, the coverage nationally was such that if I was going to Montreal from Toronto or somewhere else, it was a little touch and go, which is why I asked that question.
I mean, it's why the network sharing deal with TELUS is so transformational. Because now you can take your Freedom mobile phone to Montreal, and you're going to get the same network experience that you have on the big three.
It's funny because it's not that long of a time since Wind existed and now, and it's pretty significantly different, the network landscape. Even though it's the same companies, the actual backbone is quite different. And by the way, for those listening to all those frequency stuff, it's also worth noting, just for the non-initiated, that you can't just start a wireless company in Canada. You have to have, like, I can't do Robco. There's spectrum that's owned and licensed. The government at least licenses it out, and then companies have to license it. So you can't just start a company without having some spectrum to run your cell phone service, which is why you were talking all about the TELUS and the network sharing and all that other stuff.
You can if you want to broadcast using a ham radio, but that's about it.
And by the way, I thought of a name for your company, Tony Mobile, T-Mobile, right? That's never been done before, right?
Yeah. More and more tech leaders, some of them absolute giants, have been making the same discovery, and it is Linebox Studio, the architectural firm that has become the dominant force in designing offices and headquarters for serious IT firms. We're talking Shopify, Element AI, Clipfolio, BenchSci, Gsoft, and now Hootsuite have learned that a great team and groundbreaking work gets inspiration from what surrounds them. Linebox has designed winning environments for all of them. So are you their next success story? Find out at linebox.ca.
Looking at Rogers' share price, which is exactly the same as it was the first day of January, and we're recording this in late June, notwithstanding the headwinds of like the monopoly or the Competition Bureau taking a look at it, we've got interest rates going up, tech downturn, Rogers seems to be affected by it, maybe an upcoming recession. Do any of these sort of institutional forces lend any positive or minus negative to what you're trying to do you think?
I mean, it's a great question, because you're not just talking about uncertainty around, rates and tech downturn. You're talking about inflation. You're talking about the war in the Ukraine, food security, energy security. I mean, there's just a lot of uncertainty in the world right now. And it's no doubt there's a cloud over the capital markets as a result, coming from all those things at once. It's a challenge. Our costs to do this transaction have gone up a lot. They've gone up as much as interest rates have risen already.
Yeah.
Plus an additional risk factor associated with all that uncertainty coming from food security, energy security, inflation, war, and rates going up. On the business side, though, the truth is that people's mobile device is like the most important thing to them. I mean, it's crazy what people will give up before they give up their mobile phone. I'm going to give up my car. Do I need the lights on, really? Do I really need the lights on?
The phone can function as a light if you need it.
It's recession-proof in a lot of ways. The business itself, not in a lot of ways, in a fundamental way, in that the utility is total now in people's life. But I think it's adding risk to the transaction for sure.
Does it factor into Rogers' calculus at all, do you think, in any way, shape, or form?
Look, I mean, Rogers got a backstop on the whole transaction before the market really turned down. So that was one of not very many smart moves they made on this whole endeavor. That was one smart move they definitely made. I think that there's far more risk that the Bureau or the federal government, whether it's ISED or the Prime Minister's office, they just actually block this transaction. It's so unpopular with Canadians. Is there any remedy that'll work? And Matthew Boswell's current position is there is no remedy that would ever make this good for Canadians. So we're blocking it, the whole thing. And that includes Globalive. He's saying there is no remedy.
What's the base case then? It just floats in space as
there's just no deal. Shaw's got to figure out a different buyer. They keep it or they figure out a different buyer. I mean, it's not like it's a money losing business. I mean, it's a very profitable business, the legacy business. For sure.
I'll take it for $50. Look, at least he didn't buy Twitter.
Yeah, well, if you're coming in at 50, I'm going to come in 51. So
okay. I would, given the succession level tweets and plotting and hatching that happened at Rogers executive level recently, it's funny to make jokes like that and happy Canada, but I actually don't want you to do that, Tony. I don't want to see that happen. Because you're very positive on your socials, and for you to take an Elon Musk term would just break my heart. But let's, for all of Rob's questions about the macroeconomic, I think we just turn back to what really matters. Like, forget global conditions. We are in a walled garden in Canada that is controlled by an oligopoly that is, air quotes, regulated by the government, but to the extent that which that happens entirely decides whether or not you can run this business. So a couple of things that have happened. You've sent a letter to Ottawa as of Friday, this recording, basically urging them to consider that Globalive would actually be a competitor for Canada. As you noted, the Competition Bureau, as well as the ISED, needs to approve the merger of Shaw and Rogers. Matt Boswell and the Competition Bureau are looking to block that merger, but they're also there's a competition tribunal that is working with you and Rogers, I believe, to schedule some sort of mediation. Are you involved in that, or is it just Rogers and Shaw?
No, it's got nothing to do with us. Let's be clear, guys. We are nowhere to be seen here. Again, going back to that, like, what's the worst outcome for Rogers? The worst outcome for Rogers is our actual real competitor, which is what we are. And they know we're going to bring prices down, and they don't want prices to come down. So their Videotron is the current solution they're proposing. And we're relying as Canadians, and I include myself because I have a Canadian mobile phone plan too that I'm getting gouged on too. So, I mean, we're reliant on Matthew Boswell, the Competition Bureau, and the Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, Minister Champagne, and the Prime Minister. Because this file is so important to the Liberal government, the Prime Minister's office as well. Those guys have to decide what's right for Canadians. And in my opinion, as a taxpayer, I want it to be a true independent competitor because I want to see prices come down. I'd love it to be Globalive that wins. We're in it to win it. We're not in it to send letters to Matthew Boswell. We're in it to win it, obviously. But what the outcome can't be is a friendly to Rogers that's going to keep prices high.
So then let's talk about your preferred government involvement here, because in one stage you're looking for them to get involved. But if they decide to just say, we're blocking this transaction entirely, that's possibly a net win for Canadians, but not the ultimate win that you're hoping for, or that might benefit Canadians in terms of competition. There's also a circumstance here where, like, if you go to buy more spectrum, you do that from a body that has argued recently that competition isn't necessarily a net good for Canadians, which we've discussed on this podcast previously, which blew our mind. I guess what would be the ideal regulatory oversight that's happening here? Because going to the Prime Minister because it's an important file to make a decision with broad implications doesn't really point to a government structure or process that regulates radio and television effectively. So I'm wondering, like, understanding that you're in negotiation with these people to be in negotiation at all, what is the functional framework that should happen? And even you can take that down the road to the spectrum auction that if this works, you're going to have to participate in.
I mean, I want to restate, like, we're not in any negotiation with anyone. The incumbents do not want us around this. We're a real competitor. We're going to bring prices down.
Well, you're advocating at least for an outcome to allow negotiation, I guess, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's a better way to put it. But there's, like, when we send the letter like we did on Friday to Commissioner Boswell, like, we're not in any kind of negotiation. We're putting forward our perspective. But what we get back is thank you, received. That's it, right? There's no
classic
engagement.
Boswell.
Yeah.
In French.
Right? There's no engagement from them. Thanks for the letter, and we got it, and see you later.
but you've been in a position where you're on the other side of this, right? So, like, from that perspective too, how would you want this to happen?
Look, I believe in a 4-carrier system, right? So there's this big debate. Do you need 3 or do you need 4? I actually think in Canada, because we have so much noise with all of the flanker brands or sub-brands, right? And Canadians still don't know that. People don't know that Fido and Chatter is owned by Rogers. Kudo is owned by TELUS.
Crave is owned by Bell. We could extend this out beyond just
we can just
smartphones.
Keep going, right? Yeah. I actually, I do I love, as much as I like have market research, I'm the kind of person I walk out on the street and I ask people these questions, and about a third of people look at me like I'm insane. Like, who is this idiot talking to me?
Who's this handsome man asking me about who my wireless carrier is?
What's this guy talking about? But a lot of people will stop and talk because the mobile price is like an issue for them. And so I try to say, like, I'm not connected to anything. And it's like, but very few people know Fido is owned by Rogers. Very few people know that Koodo is owned by Tel. So there's a lot of noise in the Canadian market with all those sub brands. What I would like to see is a framework that is a 4-carrier framework. And I would like to see sub brands having to be disclosed the way they are in the United States. When you look at a Sprint store in the United States, it says Sprint by T-Mobile on the sign of the store. When you see a Metro PCS store, it says Metro PCS by T-Mobile. This is the transparency we need to bring to the Canadian telecom industry. You can have a Fido, Rogers, sure, but it's Fido by Rogers. And so we need that kind of transparency to come everywhere in the Canadian telecom industry. It sounds so obvious when I say it out loud, but no one's talking about that. So we need a policy framework that is a transparent, straight up, honest, independent 4 set of carriers.
Is that coming through the CRTC or the Competition Bureau or both? Who owns the responsibility of implementing that? Because it's not going to come from the legislature.
It's the minister. No, it's the minister. It's the fourth carrier policy is, the responsibility. It was formerly the Ministry of Industry. Now it's Industry, Science, and Economic Development. When we founded Wind, it was the start of the 4th carrier policy in 2007, and we launched in 2009. And that 4th carrier policy has worked a little bit. There's been some positive effects, but in Ontario, BC, and Alberta, it has not worked yet. And so what my plan is to go back to the business plan here. Our original plan was to build a national independent wireless carrier in Canada. Okay. That's still our business plan. We got stopped short when we were forced to sell Wind. I never wanted to sell Wind. We're going to come back now. We're going to build a national carrier, and we're leveraging a network and spectrum sharing agreement with TELUS to do that. But we're bringing in the capital to buy a whole bunch more spectrum, buy the existing Freedom spectrum, buy more spectrum, build out a national carrier. We're going to be a national independent carrier. To Rob's point about T-Mobile, like that's what it's gonna look like. We're not selling bundles. We're not, like, who cares about a legacy cable and home phone connection? We're selling wireless pure play, and then we're going to be selling fixed wireless access. T-Mobile is now the fastest growing internet carrier in the United States, and they're doing it all on wireless, right? It's on 5G, on C-band and 600. They're all on wireless. There will be content services, Internet of Things, the connected everything. To your point, Douglas, we obviously want wireless plans to come down in price, but connected everything is going to happen on terrestrial, cellular, and fixed wireless access on a 5G network, and we're going to do it on a national basis. We need a policy framework that continues the set-asides of spectrum, that requires the transparent disclosure of who is which carrier, and we need 4 truly independent carriers. And so we're not that far away from it. But in Quebec and in the Maritimes, having Eastlink as a 4th or Videotron as a 4th is not effective. A cable company is always going to lean on the bundle because they want to slow the erosion of the legacy dying businesses. I don't want to give people a great wireless deal and have them cut the cord. If I'm in the cable business and the home phone business, right? All I'm doing is I'm just cannibalizing my own business. And so that's why things roll out slowly in Canada. It's not like Verizon and AT&T did not want to have to compete, but T-Mobile put so much pressure on them that, now the United States is a very competitive market. And so in the US, there was T-Mobile and Sprint now owned by T-Mobile, and there's a new 4th carrier that's Dish, right? As you guys know, led by Charlie Ergen, and they're competing super aggressive. The US has 2 big bundle carriers, Verizon and AT&T, and they got 2 national pure play independents. And where our price is 30-40% below Canada. So you're asking what the policy framework should be? The good news is we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Let's just look south of the border. Where, by the way, all Canadians know. I mean, I don't even know a single Canadian that doesn't know it's cheaper in the US. I mean, everybody knows that. So why I'm saying to the government, why don't we just look? We don't have to try to reinvent the wheel. Let's just look south of the border. And what's the framework there? And this is very interesting. When T-Mobile was acquiring Sprint, the regulator told them what the remedy is going to be, and it ended up being a new 4th carrier, Dish. So in what universe does it make sense in Canada for the regulator to not tell Rogers what it's going to be? And thankfully, I feel like that might be happening. We have Commissioner Boswell and Minister Champagne saying, look, you guys can't put forward these weak non-remedies, these weak competitors. It's going to be a real competitor. And so I think, look, I'm fingers crossed, guys. I think that we might enter a new phase in Canada where we will have real competition finally.
Last question. If this doesn't happen, is there a pathway, or are you willing to try to launch a new telecom brand net new? Is that even possible in 2022 anymore?
I think that depending on what the set-aside rules are in the next auction, and subject to my earlier point about there needing to be a fourth national carrier that's independent, if the outcome is a cable company, which again, it really shouldn't be, because for all the reasons, just looking south of the border, right? Regional cable companies cannot compete in wireless out of their territory, which is why Videotron is just impossible as a solution. Shaw was never a solution. Eastlink is not a solution. If it goes that way, where there is a framework for a independent national fourth, then I'm up for coming at it in any which way I can. And no one thought we could do it in 2007, 2008, right? We started it from zero. It's obviously a lot more difficult. You guys cover a lot of startups. You know how hard it is.
Competition is hard for software companies, not when you're putting up towers to cover spectrum to connect
with Wind, there was $800 million invested before $1 of revenue. Okay.
And they tried to stop you right before you launched. They said you couldn't launch.
Well, they did. Yeah. And for 2 months we were blocked. It is a very tough haul.
So are you willing to do that again?
I am willing to go at it if there's a framework that can make sense, as it looked like it did in 2008. And as long as we're talking about a national independent platform, the answer is yes. And look, I love this country. I wrote a book about how much I love this country. We need our wireless industry to be competitive. We need our wireless industry to be competitive because it's so important to every single corner of our economy and every part of our personal lives, that every single Canadian has cost-effective wireless, that it's accessible to all Canadians, including in the rural areas that we're talking about, but accessible to everyone. Because in downtown Toronto, wireless is out of reach for a lot of people. And that makes no sense. So it's the only thing I know anything about, guys. So it's my way of making a contribution to the country I love and hopefully making some money along the way. But I'm one of these people, let's stick to our knitting, right? Because I don't know shit about anything else. So I'm gonna make wireless work.
Well, Tony, as a independent journalists, a media entity, we can take no sides in these interesting conversations and debate. But I'll let you know that my wallet would be interested in more competition.
Great, guys. Look, I really appreciate you guys' interest in it. And you guys do a great job following the tech scene in Canada generally. And I know you've been following this story. I really appreciate you making the time for me. And I'm happy to come back on. And I'm going to fight the good fight until somebody kills me.
Awesome, man. The BetaKit podcast is produced by BetaKit Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.